Okay, so the classical eudaimonists think that everybody has an ultimate end, that everything we do is for the sake of one single unitary overarching end, which they call eudaimonia, which is usually translated as happiness, well-being, flourishing, success at living a good human life, something like that. The term originally meant having a favorable guardian spirit, being well demoned, but it had lost that literal connotation by this period. Anyway, so classically, I think everyone has a single unitary overarching ultimate end they're aiming at. And they defend this claim on something like praxeological grounds. They argue that a conceptual analysis of the nature of action will show that we're committed to regarding ourselves as having such an end. However, Thomas Hobbes gives something like a praxeological argument against an ultimate end. He argues that if you really think about the nature of action, you'll see we can't have an ultimate end. So we've got kind of a celebrity death match here between the Greeks and Hobbes. You can guess which side I'm going to come down on, but let me explain what Hobbes' argument is. Hobbes thinks that if you had an ultimate end and you achieved it, then all your desires would be satisfied. Because if everything we do is for the sake of this one all-consuming end, then once you have it, then there can't be anything left out. So once you achieved your ultimate end, you would have no unsatisfied desires. But he says, and this might, the wording of this might remind you of Mises, Hobbes says all action is motivated by dissatisfaction. Whenever you act, because clearly you're not happy with the way things are. If you were happy with the way things were, you just stick with them. Whenever you act, you're trying to change the situation. So the fact that you're acting shows that you have some unsatisfied desires. And therefore, the fact that you're acting shows that you do not currently have your ultimate end. Therefore, if we ever achieved the ultimate end, it would be the cessation of all activity. You just have to lie like a lump. In fact, you'd have to stop inhaling and exhaling. And that would soon be the end of your career. So, there cannot be such a thing as an ultimate end, at least, not in this life, says Hobbes. And therefore, he thinks that all these ancient Greek and Roman and medieval thinkers who all talk about there being this ultimate end. Now, the medieval thinkers had an out because they thought that the really ultimate end would be union with God in the afterlife. However, they did think that there was a kind of a second best ultimate end in this life. And Hobbes is arguing you can't have anything like an ultimate end in this life. Now, Aristotle, for example, might seem to open himself up to this kind of worry, because he says that eudaimonia all by itself makes life choice-worthy and lacking in nothing. That's a quote from Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Well, then, you can see why someone might think, if that's what you've got, then what you've got is somehow all-inclusive. There's nothing lacking, and therefore there must not be any unsatisfied desires if you've got eudaimonia. But Aristotle also defines eudaimonia as a life of virtuous rational activity. In this case, I want to stress the activity part. Aristotle thinks that a person who has achieved or has got the ultimate end, a happy person, a person who's living a happy life, is going to be active, doing all kinds of things. And there's a puzzle. This is the puzzle that Hobbes is trying to push, which is, if this happy person is doing all sorts of things, what's motivating them? What's motivating you to do things? You must have some unsatisfied desires, or you wouldn't be running around doing stuff. If you've got unsatisfied desires, you must not be happy. Okay, well, let me give what I think is the first stage of an answer from the classical eudaimonist perspective to this worry. Now, we'll see this doesn't completely kill off Hobbes, and Hobbes will come back in weaker form later and have to be put down again. But here's at least the first move, first couple moves. First of all, it's a mistake to think that action expresses dissatisfaction with the way things are. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes action expresses dissatisfaction with the way things would be if you didn't act. In fact, this is a point that Robert Nozick makes, as I recall, in his article on Austrian methodology. So I give this example, since we're talking about Greeks. I'll have Orpheus. Here he is strumming on his lyre, playing away. And he's perfectly happy with the way things are. But the way things are isn't a static state. The way things are is this ongoing activity of his playing. He's playing to keep the activity going. So he's dissatisfied with the way things would be if he stopped acting. He doesn't like this counterfactual way things would be if he weren't making this music. But now, as long as it's going on, he's happy with that. So sometimes you can act to keep something happening rather than acting to change things. Another point is this distinction between instrumental and constitutive means. If you think of all means as instrumental, all means as something external to the end that's going to somehow causally bring the end about, then it does make sense to think of acting as trying to change things. But sometimes an action could be a constitutive means. The action is itself, keeping the action going is itself part of the end you want to achieve. In which case, you wouldn't necessarily be dissatisfied as you're going along. Incidentally, I don't say this in the notes, but incidentally, I think this is a possible objection to an argument Mises makes in Human Action, where he says that if there's a God, God could not engage in action. And his argument there is that action always involves use of means to ends. But if you're omnipotent, you can just have the end instantly. You don't need the means. And therefore, an omnipotent being couldn't act, in which case it's not so omnipotent. But at least as far as that argument goes, I don't think that works, because some of your means might be constitutive rather than instrumental means. So your goal might include, it's not that you've got this goal that's defined independently of action, and then you're doing these actions to bring about the goal. You're performing certain actions might be part of the goal you're aiming at. In which case, if they're sort of conceptually part of it, then even an omnipotent being couldn't dispense with those means, and therefore could act, for what it's worth. All right, well, then, these considerations I'm offering to show that, contrary to what Hobbes says, an ultimate end is not praxeologically impossible. It's not just inherently impossible, given the nature of action, for us to achieve an ultimate end. Now, there's still Hobbesian-type worries about the realisticness of this coming up later, but at least that's to fend off the claim that it's praxeologically impossible. Now I want to show, and here I'm going to borrow heavily from Plato and Aristotle, I want to show that the notion of an ultimate end is praxeologically required. So I'm going to try and give some reasons to suggest why you might think that we have to consider ourselves as having some sort of ultimate end. All right, first of all, here's a point that the Greeks all agreed on. By the Greeks, I mean the Greek philosophers, not the Greeks in the street, which often had a very different view. But the Greek philosophers almost all agree, and here's something that Austrian economists also agree on: means get their value from the ends they serve. This is the whole point of imputation in Austrian economics, and same idea in ethics. If my only reason for doing one thing is to get some other thing, then the value of the means must depend on the value of the end. Now, of course, I might be doing this thing both for its own sake and for the sake of some other end, in which case it would be both a means and an end. But if I'm to the extent that I'm doing it as a means, to that extent, its value depends on the value of the end it serves. Aristotle gives this as a reason for thinking that there have to be some final ends. Aristotle says it couldn't be the case that I do A in order to get B, and I do B in order to get C, and I do C in order to get D, and it goes on infinitely. He thinks that doesn't make sense, because the value of any chain of means to ends depends on the value of the final link in the chain, the final end. If there is no final end, then the whole thing would have no value, he thinks. So we have to have final ends. Whenever we value something, there has to be some final end for the sake of which we're doing it. However, that doesn't settle whether there's just one end for all our actions. All that would show is that for any action you do, there has to be a final end for that action. But it might be that every action you do has a different final end, and that they don't all combine into one. So we need a separate argument to show that there's just one big end for all our actions. Now, some people thought the Greeks are just making a silly mistake here. Some people thought the Greeks are just sliding from the claim that there's an ultimate end for each of our actions to the claim that there's some one ultimate end for all of them together, which that would be an example of the fallacy of composition, thinking that because something is true of each member of a group separately, it's somehow true of the whole group collectively. And that would be a fallacy. A lot of people think that the Greeks are making that fallacy. But I don't think so. Anyway, I'm going to try to avoid making that fallacy. Why might we think that we have not just some final ends, or not just a final end for each of our actions? Why might we think that we have one big final end that sums the final end of all our actions put together? Why should we think we're committed to thinking of it that way? Well, think about cases when you're making trade-offs. Suppose there are two things you want, and you can't have both. I don't know if that's ever happened to you, but sometimes it happens that there are two things, and you'd like to have them both, but you have to pick one. So you're choosing between, I'll call them creatively, A and B. And when you can't have both, you have to decide which one to pick. And so you weigh the options in your mind. You try to go about deciding. You deliberate. You try to make a decision about which one to pick. Well, that process is itself an action. When you're deliberating about whether to have A or B, you are engaging in an action. All action aims at an end. What is the end of this action? I'm trying to choose between A and B. What is my goal? Well, it can't be A. My aim, the thing I'm trying to get in choosing between A and B, can't be A, because I haven't yet settled whether it's A I'm going for. I might decide to go for B. So the goal can't be A by itself. And for the same reason, the goal can't be B by itself. Could it be both? Could be, A plus B. Is that my goal in deliberating? Well, no, because we've already assumed that A plus B is not an available option. I've already given up that option. I have to choose one or the other. I can't have both. So when I'm choosing between A and B, my goal is not A and B both together. Could it be A or B? My choice is somehow A or B. That's the situation I want to bring about. Well, no, because then I wouldn't have to deliberate. I could just randomly pick one and would get me that. I don't just want one or the other, not care which. I want something more than that. So whenever we deliberate, we've got some goal in mind. Whenever we deliberate trying to choose between A and B, we've got some goal in mind that isn't A and it isn't B. And it isn't A and B, and it isn't A or B. What is it? Well, we might say it's something like maximizing the satisfaction of our preferences, which I'm going to call max-pref for short. Now, it's going to turn out that that's a slippery description. We're going to need to fiddle with it later. But we can just use it as a first approximation for now. When I try to choose between A and B, I'm trying to decide which one would maximize my preferences, which would give me the most of what I want. Meaning not the most in terms of physical quantity, but the most in terms of value. I'm trying to get as much of as possible of what I want. So it turns out that in addition to all my particular ends, I've got to have, if deliberation is an essential feature of rational agency, then in addition to all my particular ends, I have to have this more general end of maximizing as many of these as possible, or as much of it as possible, or something like that. Maximizing may be a worrisome term here, because it might make it sound as though there are some cardinal quantities that you're adding up, and I don't think that's quite the right way to think about it. But still, there's some sense in which you're trying to do as best as you can to satisfy your preferences. Given that you can't satisfy them all, you want to satisfy the greatest number of the more important ones, or something like that. And I'm calling that max-pref. Now, someone might say, well, all right, anyone who deliberates must have the goal of maximizing their satisfaction of their preferences. Well, what about beings that don't deliberate? Suppose they're a rational agent that never engaged in deliberation. Well, I'm inclined to think that that wouldn't really be a rational agent. But if you think that there are rational agents that don't engage in deliberation, or that there could be, I'll say, all right, well, then my argument would only apply to the subset of rational agents who deliberate. I have a hard time seeing what rationality would be in an agent who didn't deliberate, but I don't want to quibble about the term. But I'm going to use the term rational agent in such a way that includes deliberation. All right, so turns out that in addition to all your particular ends, if you're a rational agent who deliberates, then you must also have this end of satisfying as much as possible of your most important preferences or something like that. Now, given that, whenever you choose something, that choice expresses a preference for that thing over any of its rivals. And so I'm going to claim that means that whenever you choose something, that choice expresses a judgment that that thing advances your max pref better than anything else. Now, someone might want to quibble about that. Someone might want to say, well, maybe it doesn't express any judgment at all. You've got this preference, which is sort of like a brute desire. Why assume that there's any judgment involved? Well, I guess I just have trouble seeing how in a rational agent, as opposed to, I don't know, in an earthworm or something, but in a rational agent, I have a hard time making sense of the notion of a preference. If the preference can't be expressed as a judgment, this gets me more of what I want than that. But at least that's the point where someone could try and put up a fight. But suppose you grant that whenever you choose something, that your choice expresses a judgment that that thing advances your max pref. Well, it seems to me that at least comes pretty close to saying that whatever you choose is chosen, whatever else it's chosen as, it's chosen, among other things, as a means to your max pref. Whatever you choose, you're choosing it because, or part of the reason you're choosing it at least, is because it promotes your max pref. And therefore, whatever you choose is chosen as a means to your max pref. And this will give us a reason for identifying max pref with the Greek notion of eudaimonia, at least initially. This is suggested that there is a goal that everyone has, in addition to all their particular goals of water right now or whatever. That everyone has, this broader, more systematic goal of trying to get as much of what they want as possible. But you might think, and this is where the Hobbesian objection is raising its head again, you might think, well, wait a second. All right, max pref is like eudaimonia in that sense. But there's some fancy features eudaimonia is supposed to have that max pref doesn't seem to have. Remember that eudaimonia all by itself makes life choice-worthy and lacking in nothing. That's what Aristotle says about it. That's what the sort of thing that the Greek philosophers in general say about this ultimate goal. But we've just seen that the pursuit of max pref involves trade-offs. The whole example I gave is a case where you want both A and B, and you can't have both, and so you pick whichever one is going to most maximize your preference satisfaction. But it seems as if total satisfaction of all your preferences isn't on the cards. If you're choosing something for the sake of max pref, you're not choosing it for the sake of getting all the things you want. Because it seems like if you're doing trade-offs, you're already recognizing you can't have everything you want. So it might seem as though we haven't got a full conception of eudaimonia here. Now, here's a possible answer, and I think this possible answer is on the right track. It's not complete. More needs to be said. But the first thing to say is that maybe we should say that eudaimonia includes not everything worth wishing for, but everything worth choosing. After all, what Aristotle says is it includes everything choice-worthy. He doesn't say it includes everything wish-worthy. It also includes the things we wish for that we can't choose because we know that they're impossible. Or at least, if they're not impossible, at least there's something that there's nothing you can do right now to bring it about. I'd like to be able to teleport. That's something worth wishing for, but that's not something worth choosing. It's not something. So Aristotle doesn't think that the fact that we can't teleport instantly all around the planet means that our lives are unhappy, that our lives are importantly lacking. Maybe it would be cool if we could teleport. It'd be cool if we could live 1,000,000 years. It would be cool if we could levitate things by waving our hands around. All kinds of stuff would be cool. Those are things worth wishing for, worth thinking it would be cool to have, but they're not worth choosing. So you might say, well, maybe eudaimonia is just stuff worth choosing. But then comes the problem, which I mentioned briefly toward the end of the last lecture. Suppose something is currently unattainable. It's not unattainable like teleportation. It's something that, is possible in the ordinary run of things, but just I can't get it right now. For example, suppose I fall into a well, and I can't get out. I could get out if someone came along and brought a ladder or something. But right now, there's no one around with a ladder. Right now, I can't get out. Right now, currently, getting out is unattainable. So all the getting out is worth wishing for. You might think it's not worth choosing. I mean, it's not even something I can choose in the current situation. It's not even something I can try to do. It's nothing I can, the walls are, utterly smooth and it's very deep, and there's nothing I can do to get out. So getting out of the well, you may think, is not worth choosing in that context. It's not a legitimate object of choice. But if you think that eudaimonia includes everything choice-worthy, but not everything worth wishing for, you might think, well, that means, hey, then I should be happy at the bottom of the well. I'm not lacking anything worth choosing. I'm lacking something worth wishing for, but we already agreed that we didn't want our conception of eudaimonia to be so utopian. It would include everything you might conceivably wish for, like powers of Superman or something. So suppose you say that eudaimonia includes only what is worth choosing, and that therefore, as soon as something becomes unavailable, it's not worth choosing. And so it ceases to be part of the content of eudaimonia. I'm going to call that accommodationism, the idea that you might also call it adaptationism, the idea that the content of eudaimonia adapts itself to what the circumstances are. So if something is not available, then it stops being part of eudaimonia. It's not worth choosing. Well, one problem with this is it seems to make eudaimonia too easy. Throw me in the bottom of the well and I should be happy because I can't get out. Throw in some snakes that are biting me. If I can't get rid of the snakes, then once again, getting rid of the snakes is not worth choosing. So again, I should be perfectly happy down there. Because as long as the things I lack are things I can't get, then it seems like I've got everything worth choosing. And that seems like a kind of an icky conception of success. That didn't stop some Greek philosophers from embracing it. Socrates and the Stoics both think something along those lines. Their versions of the story are different. But Socrates and the Stoics both tend to think that if something is unavailable or outside of your power to get, then you shouldn't care about it. And therefore, you'd be perfectly happy without it. For the Stoics, it's the content of happiness is just nothing but your own virtue, the only thing under your control. For Socrates, it seems to expand and contract depending on what's available. So you're allowed to care about things other than virtue as long as they're available. You take them away and bang, you shouldn't care about them anymore. But not all the Greek philosophers wanted to go for this. Aristotle, for example, thinks that there are some things outside our control matter for happiness. He doesn't think it should depend heavily on things outside our control, because that would make our happiness very vulnerable. And if our happiness is very vulnerable, it seems like we're in a bad state to some extent, and that's not happiness. But he thought that happiness could be in principle vulnerable to bad stuff that might happen. It should be largely in your control, but he didn't think it should be entirely so. And his student Theophrastus apparently went farther. How much farther we don't know because his writings are mostly lost. But apparently the people of a Stoic persuasion who read Theophrastus found him even more shocking than Aristotle in the extent to which he thought that our happiness depends on external good luck. So they at least thought that part of our happiness could depend on things not currently available. Besides, although Socrates and Stoics might think that we only should aim at things that are presently attainable, they know that we often don't. We often aim at things we know are, or at least desire or wish for, or hanker for, or feel unhappy without these other things. And that needs to be explained, given that you need to have some conception of eudaimonia, somehow that it can be all-inclusive in the way it needs to be, and yet somehow be something we do in fact aim at, or can be interpreted as aiming at, and yet nevertheless be something that somehow can be dependent on external good fortune. Well, suppose you say that we should include in eudaimonia not just what is currently attainable, but things that are in principle attainable. So maybe I shouldn't aim at teleportation because that's not in principle attainable, although I don't know that it isn't in principle attainable, but at least it's kind of far off. Whereas if I'm sitting in the so it doesn't make sense for me to think my life is going badly because I can't teleport, but it does make sense for me to think that my life is going badly if I'm at the bottom of a well and there's no ladder, because a ladder is in principle something that could be attained. Well, the problem is that if you define eudaimonia as including whatever is in principle attainable, well, the problem is it's going to be unattainable in practice, because we know that not all the things that are in principle attainable are actually going to be jointly realized by us. It's going to be, if not impossible, at least incredibly improbable. It's incredibly unlikely. And so it seems a bad idea to make our happiness depend on something that's incredibly unlikely. I hear that Bill Gates is giving a lot of his money away now. He might decide to give it all to me. It's possible. But it's so unlikely that it seems like it would be a bad idea to make my conception of happiness depend on his giving it to me. Well, here's the first move of an answer. This isn't, once again, it's not a complete answer, but it's moving us, I think, in the right direction. First, we can distinguish between direct versus indirect objects of choice. It's a mistake to think that you can only choose things that are right here now. Like, this glass is right here now, I can choose this. But there are things not right here now that I can, in some sense, choose. For example, I can choose now to go to Paris next May. Now, it doesn't mean that right now I can do something that guarantees that I will be in Paris next May. That's beyond my power. And so the Stoics would think it would be silly for me to choose. But still, I can start doing things now whose point is that they will eventually get me to Paris then. I could make reservations now, or I could, there are various things I could start doing now that would count as my aiming. So in some sense, I'm choosing the goal. Now, of course, I can't do anything now that will guarantee that I'll be in Paris, but I can do things that will make it a lot more likely. So you could say, maybe we should define eudaimonia not, on one extreme, as everything worth wishing for, which is bring us teleportation, all kinds of loopy stuff, nor just everything directly choice-worthy, which seems to constrict it too much, but maybe eudaimonia should be everything worth striving for. Not everything worth directly choosing right here, not everything worth wishing for either. Teleportation is not worth wishing for. It's not worth striving for. It's worth wishing for. But it's not worth striving for. It's not worth my doing anything to bring about teleportation, because nothing that I can do is going to have very much of a good chance of making any significant progress in that direction. Now, if I were a theoretical physicist, maybe it would be worth it, but I don't know. I'd have to be a theoretical physicist in order to know that. But that still doesn't help us with the well. Because you might think, if I'm stuck at the bottom of the well, and the sides are perfectly smooth, and there's no ladder, you might think it's not even worth striving to get out. Because I know I can't by my own efforts. I can if some good luck comes along. I can if someone comes along with a ladder. But I can't climb out myself. So it seems like it's not even worth striving for. Well, it depends how you define striving. Or maybe we want some concept that is broader than striving. But anyway, there's a sense in which if I'm in the bottom of the well, it makes sense for me to be sort of on a kind of high-tension alert. I'm always on alert, ready to hear someone walking by that I can yell out to or something. I'm constantly on high-tension alert, to do something that will get me a ladder. Even if there's nothing I can do now, I'm sort of alertly watching the opportunities. I'm intensely watching the opportunities. That's not the way I am with teleportation. I'm not constantly, scanning the physics journals looking for the latest evidence that I might be able to do something to teleport. Maybe I should, but I'm not. So now, when I'm on this sort of high-tension alertness at the bottom of the well, maybe striving isn't the right way to put that. Maybe I'm not exactly striving for a ladder, but I'm doing something like striving. I'm all geared up to grab the first opportunity to get a ladder if I can. Whereas I'm not geared up that way for the teleportation. I'm not sort of scanning every opportunity. So you could treat that as something like striving. So maybe eudaimonia includes everything worth striving for in this broad sense. But then you might think, well, why shouldn't I be that way about teleportation? Teleportation would be a good thing to have. Why shouldn't I be in a constant state of ready alertness and tension and nervousness? Thinking, I hope I don't die before they come up with teleportation, or I hope that I don't die before they come up with, the drug that will make me live for 1 million years, or whatever. Maybe it'll never happen, but should I be sort of constant nervousness about that? Well, so we have this tension between what I'm calling utopianism and accommodationism. Accommodationism is, lower your standards for happiness to fit what you're actually getting. And utopianism is expand your conception of happiness to include anything that might possibly be worth wanting. Now, the fact that something desirable is in principle possible is a reason to strive for it. It is a reason to try to do your best to go after it. Prima facie, it's a reason. So there is some reason for being a utopian. There's some reason for including everything anyone could possibly get anything out of in your conception of happiness. On the other hand, the fact that something is not immediately attainable is prima facie a reason not to strive for it. Because, it seems like you have a good chance of wasting your efforts. And that gives you some support for accommodationism. Well, you might think this is a problem, but I see this as a solution. If you had lots of reasons for being a utopian and none for being an accommodationist, then go be a utopian. If you had lots of reasons for being an accommodationist and none for being a utopian, then go be an accommodationist. If you've got some reasons in each direction, that seems like a reason why you should pick something in the middle. You've got some reason to resign yourself to whatever's going on. You've also got some reason to be have your whole life pervaded with longing, anxious longing for all sorts of things you can't have. Well, if we're trying to construct a conception of happiness out of our existing commitments, which is sort of the way I'm thinking of it here, well then you've got one vector pulling you this way, another vector pulling you that way. The result of the vectors is not going to be either direction. It's going to be somewhere in the middle. So what I'm suggesting is the content of our ultimate end isn't something that's just fixed and handed to us. It's something that we construct through practical reasoning. We try to figure out what are our commitments, and we see not only that our commitments commit us to having an ultimate end, but that our commitments commit us to a certain understanding of what it is. Now, so then the idea is going to be, this doesn't settle exactly which things fall in which category, but the idea is going to be that there could be some things not currently available that I still ought to care about, and ought to regard myself as, in a bad way for not having. If I'm stuck at the bottom of the well without the ladder, having the ladder, being out of the well, that still matters to my happiness. And so therefore, I'm in a suboptimal state if I'm down there. But things that are harder to come by, things that are less likely, like immortality drugs and teleportation and Green Lantern rings and things like that, those are things that I shouldn't waste my life longing for in such a way that it's, I'm going to regard my life as a failure if I can't get those. It's too unrealistic. However, now suppose what happens if there's something I've decided isn't worth striving for because it's just too unlikely and too far apart from my ordinary needs. I just think, well, all right, I don't care about the immortality drug or whatever. But now suppose it does become available. Now suppose suddenly that everyone in my block is getting immortality drugs or Green Lantern rings or teleportation tubes or whatever it is they've got. Now should I care? Well, now it seems as though if it's available now, or closer to being available, it seems like I've got more reason to care about it now. It's one thing, to be unhappy because, you, like everyone else on the planet, cannot teleport. It's another thing to be unhappy when you can't teleport, but most of your friends can. It seems now as though it matters now, because I don't mean so much a matter of envy, although it could be relevant, but I just mean it's now a regular part of ordinary life that's lacking to you. Just as the fact that Aristotle didn't have electricity in his home, I don't think that counts as an objection to his having led a happy life. The fact he had slaves in his home probably counts as an objection to his having led a properly happy life. But the fact that he didn't have electricity, I don't think does. But you might think lacking electricity now would count more against happiness. I'm not sure about that case, but it seems as though this might be the grain of truth in accommodationism, is that although happiness doesn't sort of radically adapt itself to its circumstances, it is somewhat context dependent. What counts as crucial to happiness could vary depending on the context. Now, see in the notes they say living to 1,000, and I was getting bolder and talking about immortality in the speech. Well, anyway, does this completely kill off the Hobbesian worry? No, not completely. Corpse of Hobbes keeps coming back zombie-like. Because you might think, well, look, there's still the following worry. Even if you say that eudaimonia contains not everything worth wishing for, but only everything worth striving for, in this broad sense of striving, it might still seem as though eudaimonia is practically impossible, because no life can realistically achieve all objects of striving. Even if some of the striving is to keep something going rather than getting new ones, there's always going to be some things you're striving for you don't get. It's hard even to imagine a life in which, there may not be sort of crucially important things, but still there are some things. There's some things in your life you're not going to get, that you'll try to get and you'll fail. How do we deal with that fact? Well, once again, I want to use the tension between these two different impulses, not as the problem, but as the solution. The accommodationist vector, the reasons for being an accommodationist, would give us a reason not to conceive or construct eudaimonia as something unattainable. Because how can it be the end of action? If we think of eudaimonia in such a way that it's impossible to get, or virtually impossible to get, it's hard to see how it could be an end of action. Because you can't really aim at something if you think it's impossible. You can't even aim at something if you think it's very, very unlikely. For example, if I went and tried to, I will try to crush this lectern. Apologies to the Mises Institute if I succeed, but I don't think I will. So I try, well, am I really trying to crush the lectern? No, I'm pushing and grunting, but trying consists not in pushing and grunting. It seems as though I don't really count as trying to crush the lectern unless I thought there was some reasonable chance. Maybe less than 50%, but still some decent chance that my doing it would succeed. If I don't think that there's any realistic chance that what I was doing would crush the lectern, then I don't think I really count as trying to. In fact, if I really thought that what I was doing had a good chance of crushing the lectern, I wouldn't have done it. It's not my lectern. Even if it were my lectern, I don't want to crush my lectern. So we can't realistically regard eudaimonia as something that is impossible or highly, highly, highly improbable. We have to regard it as something that, even if we think it's not easy to get, even if we think, you're more likely not to get it than to get it, you might think that, but still, in order to try for it, you have to think that there's, the chance isn't vanishingly small. The chance has to be good enough to be worth trying. So that's a reason not to think of it as something unattainable. On the other hand, the attraction of the utopian vector is that we don't want to shrink our conception of happiness down so that it includes, so that it gives us a reason to renounce all striving. We don't want to renounce all striving and just be satisfied with whatever is happening. I mean, the Stoics will say maybe you should do that. Some Buddhists will say you should do that, but I don't want to do that. So this gives us a reason to try to interpret Max Preff as something that both, in some sense, contains everything worth striving for, and yet also is in some sense consistent with ongoing striving for things you might not get. So we have to, so this is going to move us to try and construct exactly what notion of striving we have in mind that will make this possible. This gives us a reason to come up with a conception of striving and a conception of happiness that will make sense of this, because if we're committed to an end, and we're committed to it as in some sense including all these things, yet in some sense also not being either impossible or radically diminished, we're sort of driven by our own commitments to try and come up with something. We want to say that one's life can be good, even if it's spent, a lot of it's spent striving for something you're never going to get. It's a comfort for those of us who are working for anarchism. I don't know whether I'm ever going to get anarchism in my lifetime, but I'd hate to think that by adopting anarchism as a goal, I have thereby condemned myself to an unhappy life. Like not to think so. Well, the Stoics give a solution which I think is wrong. It's an accommodationist solution, but it's, as is often the case in philosophy, I think wrong answers are often very useful because they often contain the seed of a right answer. So here's the Stoic solution to this claim that the good life is going to involve striving for things you can't get. The Stoics think it's possible to aim at trying to achieve something without aiming at actually achieving it. It's something that they call preferred indifference. And let me try to give you as realistic examples as I can. Now, I don't actually think that there are any possible examples of this. I think the notion is actually incoherent. But I'm going to try to make an incoherent notion seem coherent now. So here's the example. Suppose that I'm a telepathic millionaire. I didn't say I was going to make it seem realistic. I said I was going to make it seem coherent. I'm a telepathic millionaire, and I offer you $1 million to try to hit the target. Doing some target practice. I'll say, I'll offer you $1 million to try your best to hit the target. And the reason I'm a telepath in the story is so I can tell whether you're trying your best. You're getting the $1 million does not depend on whether you actually hit the target. I don't care about that. I just care about you trying your best. So if you try your best to hit the target, I'll see that in your mind, and I'll give you the money, whether you actually hit it or not. If you don't try to do your best, if you don't do your best to hit the target, then you don't get the money, even if by luck you hit it. Whether you hit the target or not has nothing to do with whether you get the money. You're getting the money depends entirely on whether you try. Well, now, suppose that you don't care about the target practice for its own sake. All you want is the money. Well, it seems now you've got a reason to care about trying to hit the target. Yet, in a sense, you don't have a reason to care about actually hitting the target. You'll be perfectly content if you try your best, fail, and they give you the money. So the Stoics would say, in this case, you're treating hitting the target as a preferred indifferent. You're treating trying to hit the target as good, something you care about. But you're treating actually hitting the target as a preferred indifferent, something it's good to try to do, but doesn't matter whether you succeed. The Stoics can say about happiness, the happy life is going to be filled with striving. There's constantly things you're trying to do. But you don't care about the goal. You shouldn't care about the goal. It doesn't make sense to care about the goal. You just care about the striving. Now, I think that's praxeologically incoherent. I mean, I gave you an example that's supposed to make it sound plausible, but I don't think it really is. I don't think you can try to do something without caring about the actual doing of it. I think in the situation with the example of the target practice, what happens is that initially you have no desire to hit the target. You have a desire for money. I come along and tell you that the way to get the money is to try to hit the target. I think what you then do is you form a desire to hit the target because you have to in order to try to. I think it's fairly easy to form desires like that. You have to get yourself to care. It's not a lot of work to get yourself to care about hitting a target, but you adopt hitting a target as an aim when you do it. It doesn't mean that you have a lot of emotional investment in it, but I think you do adopt it as a genuine end. Whereas the Stoics want to say hitting the target is not an end. You have the end of trying to, but actually hitting the target is not your end. I think that trying to hit the target includes the idea that hitting the target is your end. I don't see how you can make sense of the notion of trying otherwise. So I'm at war with the Stoics on this. But here's the piece of the truth I think the Stoics are onto. In the case as described, although in order to try to hit the target, you do have to, I think, want to actually hit the target. This is a case where it's plausible that you care about trying to hit the target a lot more than you care about actually hitting it. Now that's because trying to hit the target turns out to be an instrumental means, not just to hitting it, but to getting the money, which you care about more. But anyway, what it shows is that the value of trying to do something is not always strictly reducible to the value of the end you're trying to do. Sometimes because it also comes from some other end beyond it. There might be cases where just the striving itself has some kind of value. There's an example in Adam Smith where he gives this example of a super accurate pocket watch. And this is a case where Smith is arguing with David Hume, who thinks that the reason we admire really efficient tools that are really good at producing some result, is that we think the result is good. And we care about the result, and we sympathize with the person who gets the benefit of that result and so forth. So, for example, Hume says if you see a really well-made fortress, you admire the fortress because you think, well, that fortress would be really useful in repelling the enemy, and you put yourself in the shoes of the person who has that fortress, and you think, wow, wouldn't it be cool to be so secure from the enemy in that fortress, and so on. Well, Smith thinks that that's wrong. I mean, that happens, but Smith thinks that the example he gives of the super accurate pocket watch is, he thinks that there are lots of people who really find it cool that there's a watch that keeps really super accurate time. But it's not because they have any desire to know the time with great accuracy. I mean, one reason to care about a really accurate watch is you want to know the time really accurately. But Smith thinks often, we just think it's really cool that something is so good at promoting some goal, even if the goal itself is not something we care all that much about. We're more impressed at the efficiency of the tool than we are at the actual result. Just as, if I give you a shovel, an electronic shovel that all by itself could dig 50 holes in a minute, you might think, wow, that's really cool. Not because you want 50 holes dug. You don't care about 50 holes dug, but you just think, wow, isn't that cool? Look at that thing going on and digging. So Smith thinks there are lots of cases where the fact that something is good at promoting a goal gives us a reason to value it over and above the value we put on the goal itself. And Smith is actually borrowing this idea to some extent from the Stoics, though he's taking it out of the Stoic context and putting it in his own context. But what I want to suggest is that sometimes striving can be valuable for reasons other than what it's striving for. And I think in order to strive for something, you have to care about the thing, not just the striving. But there can be cases where you care about the striving not just for the sake of its goal, but also for its own sake, or for its role as a constitutive means, a constitutive part of happiness, and not just as a means to the further goal. So here's my suggestion. Suppose we distinguish degrees of eudaimonia. Suppose we think eudaimonia can come in degrees. And by degrees, I don't just mean being closer to or farther from it, which is what the Stoics thought that was the only way you could have degrees of eudaimonia. They thought that all people who were unhappy were completely unhappy, and all people who were unvirtuous were completely wicked. They said, if you're drowning in a foot of water or a mile of water, it doesn't matter. Either way, you're equally dead because you're. So that's the sense in which, for example, orange is redder than green. Orange is not red. Green is not red. Orange is closer to red than green is. In that sense, we say orange is redder than green. Well, that's not the sense of degrees of happiness I'm talking about. I'm talking about cases where two people are genuinely happy, are genuinely eudaimon, but one is happier than the other. So think of this not as the way in which orange is more red than green, but in the way in which one shade of red is redder than another. You can have two shades of red, but we often think, well, one of them is redder. The other one is paler, or something like that. You've got a pale red and a bright red, and you tend to think the bright red is redder. At least I tend to think that. Rather than thinking of eudaimonia as a cutoff above which it's all one thing and below which it's all one thing, think that once you have eudaimonia, then it can come in degrees, and you can have more and less of it. And this would be a reason to redefine max pref. So it isn't just going to be the maximization of the satisfaction of your preferences, but something more complicated. I warned you that there would have to be a reason to define it in a more complicated way. So suppose I say that there's a minimum threshold of things worth striving for. If you fall below that threshold, you're not happy. If you fall below the threshold, your life is not a success. What that minimum threshold is will be partly context relative. I don't think it's completely context relative, but partly so. Once you get above that level of the minimum threshold, then you are happy. But at that point, you can have more or less of happiness. So it's not as though there's something other than happiness that you want. Because one of Aristotle's arguments is happiness must include everything worth having, because otherwise it wouldn't be the best thing. Because happiness plus something else would be better than happiness itself. But if we think of getting better off, not as a matter of adding something external to happiness, but of getting more of what you already have, then I think that can allow us to reconcile some of these contradictions. So there's a minimum threshold. Below you're unhappy, above you're happy. But once you're there, then more higher levels can make you happier. You're not getting something external to happiness, you're getting more of happiness. And then it might be that there are some things where the striving for them is part of happiness at a lower level. And actually getting those things is also part of happiness, but at a higher level. So if you don't strive for them, you're not happy. If you strive for them and don't get them, you are happy. Those things are going to be, the striving is going to be one of the minimum things. Now, there's some things where if you don't get them, you strive for them, you don't get them, you won't be happy. But there's some things where if you strive for them and don't get them, nevertheless, the striving is part of happiness, although at a lower level. But if you actually get it, well, that's even better. Not only is the striving good, but striving it plus getting it is even better than striving for it without getting it. And so you can have these different levels. So here's what I'm saying. I'm saying that I think that we're committed to thinking of our happiness in this way. The point of this is that we're trying to figure out what our ordinary desires and preferences and so forth commit us to. And I think we're committed to thinking of ourselves as having some overarching goal. Because when we deliberate and choose between things, there must be some overarching goal that deliberation is a means to. It's going to be something like maximizing our preferences. But on the one hand, it doesn't make sense to think of that goal as something impossible or virtually impossible, because we can't realistically think of ourselves as aiming at something if we think it's virtually impossible. But on the other hand, we don't want to think of this goal as something that's so easy to get that all you need is for something to be unavailable and bang, you don't need it anymore, because that doesn't really capture what we strive for either. We want a conception of it that doesn't include everything worth wishing for. Because it's not the case that whenever you're acting, you're trying to get something that includes teleportation and immortality drugs. Well, actually, okay, I know some extropians for whom that might be true, but for most of us, it's not the case that we're aiming at some grand thing of everything worth wishing for. For that matter, some of the things worth wishing for are not jointly realizable. Maybe not even logically jointly realizable. You might be in love with two people, and what you want is a monogamous relationship with each of them. That's your ideal. So you can't have it. So it can't be that the element of all our actions is something that includes everything worth wishing for. It doesn't even make sense. But so it has to somehow be adapted to possibility. But we don't want to adapt it to possibility so much that we say that the person trapped at the bottom of the well has got everything they want. So we need some conception of happiness that can allow us to have it and yet still be striving for things. And yet for the things we're striving for not to be something distinct from happiness, but to somehow be included in it. And the only way I can see to do that is to have levels of happiness where you're happy, but you can still be striving. But what you're striving for is more happiness, more of what you've got. rather than something external to it. Okay, questions about that? Yes?
I like your conclusion. I came to a similar one, but it started with thinking about health. I work in healthcare, and there are two different ways that people use the term health. Some people use it as, I'm glad I've got my health, as it's something that's achieved. It's a milestone, and you either have it or you don't. And I found it more helpful to talk about it as something with gradations, with, I guess to borrow these terms, like a constitutive parts, like your heart would be healthy, and your lungs would be healthy. And if you didn't have one of them, if your heart stopped beating, you wouldn't have any of them. And if you didn't have a certain level of health in your nervous system, your heart and your lungs wouldn't work very well. And so they depend on each other, and health becomes something that you can see as kind of a gradation of achievement, if you will. And so you ask someone, how's your health today, as opposed to, do you have health today? Or like, you wouldn't ask, do you have pneumonia today? Or you might ask, how's your demon today? Or something.
It's a very personal question.
I like that conclusion. And I also wonder about, and I think Aristotle included some things like physical health and wealth and things like that. So most of what I've read, or in limited amounts what I've read about him, he focuses on the virtues like wisdom and justice and things like that. So someone might say, well, my demon's good today, I've got lots of justice and wisdom today, or something like that.
I often say that.
Or, well, it's okay, my wisdom is way down, my justice is so-so. So, that was just a thought. Similar conclusions I reached coming at it with the different concepts.
Okay, so for those who, for all those listening at home, the comment was from someone who's worked in the health sciences, who points out that these different ways of thinking about health. You could think about health as all or nothing. You've got health or you don't. Or you could think of health as a matter of degree, and you can think of health as having constituent parts. So you could talk about the health of your heart and the health of your lungs and so forth, and think of it as a matter of degree rather than all or nothing. And they also mentioned that Aristotle includes health and wealth and things like that, not just virtue. Virtue is sort of the centerpiece of eudaimonia, but Aristotle does include health and that sort of thing in there. I think health is a good analogy, and here's a way of thinking about sort of this tension between these different ways of thinking about it. You can put it in terms of health. Suppose you wanted to define health in such a way, so someone could have a very utopian conception of health and say you don't count as healthy unless there's no conceivable way that you could be improved health-wise. Well, if you define health that way, then there are no healthy organisms on this planet. Well, maybe. Well, anyway, let's say I'll go with that. Maybe there's some counterexample, but at least there are no healthy human beings on this planet. If you think of, if health means that there's no way you could be, no way that your health could be improved, and so you say, well, we don't want this utopian conception of health where you're not healthy unless you are Superman or something. Well, not Superman, because it goes beyond health. I mean, you're not healthy unless somehow there is absolutely no physical correction of any kind that can be made. So then you might say, all right, well, then we're just going to say, we'll tone down our conception of health to something weaker. If you say that, then, what are these further enhancements you might have? Are they not health? If I'm healthy, even though I've got some negative condition, then, what is that further thing? Well, then you want to say that there are degrees of health. But still, you might want to say, well, there are some things that, so you might want to say, well, maybe there's some cutoff below which you're just not healthy at all. Maybe you want to say that, maybe you don't. But anyway, this would be sort of analogous to the story I'm telling with happiness, is below a certain point, you're not healthy. Above that point, as long as you got, enough of you is working well enough, you are, ta-da, healthy. But that doesn't mean that, no improvement is possible. You could be even healthier. You could have more of that same thing, health, that you've already got. So that would be kind of a way of drawing an analogy with what I'm doing with happiness, to avoid either making health too easy or too hard. Yes?
It seems to me that whether or not waiting in a state of tense readiness for something might depend not only on the probabilities, but also on your alternatives. That is, let's say you were at the bottom of this well in a fairly isolated area where you're pretty unlikely to be found. Still, there's probably not much that counts as a flourishing human life at the bottom of a well, and so it would still make sense to devote a lot of your energy to trying to be alert for the possibility of rescue. But let's say you were lost on a remote desert island instead, where also you were equally unlikely to be found, but where at least there were more opportunities for living a flourishing human life on the island, where spending a lot of time in a state of tense readiness might actually interfere with your flourishing in other ways.
Yeah, the question or suggestion is that whether you should stay in a state of tense readiness to seize some unlikely opportunity should it come along, should depend not only on how likely or unlikely the option is, but also on what your alternatives are. So if you're stuck at the bottom of a well, however likely or unlikely rescue is, being stuck at the bottom of the well offers so little scope for flourishing that you might as well stay in a state of tense readiness. Whereas if you're on a fairly well-provided desert island, maybe it doesn't make so much sense to spend so much of your time in tense readiness to get off it, because you might be spoiling your chances for getting what kind of happiness is available to you on the island. Yeah, that certainly makes sense to me. I mean, think about, for example, I didn't use this example earlier, but I was thinking about it. Suppose that if interplanetary travel were much easier and more common than it is now, then being stuck on one planet and not being able to get off it would be bad. Whereas we're all stuck on this planet and can't get off it, but it doesn't bother us, A, because there aren't that many, it's not that likely to for us to get off it, but B, because this planet's not so bad. If we were stuck on Venus and couldn't get off it, there'd be more reason to be in a state of tense readiness, even if the chances of getting off it were no better. Charles?
I'm wondering if maybe a better fit for the praxeological category that you're looking for in trying to spell out eudaimonia might be, rather than stuff you're striving for, something like stuff you're hoping for. Because I don't know how to spell out hope exactly in non-psychologistic terms, but supposing that there's some way to do so, you can say things like, you don't necessarily have to change what you're saying to make it fit things like the well case or the desert island case or what have you. At some point, under the ordinary sense of the term striving, Robinson Crusoe just stopped sort of striving to get off the island, but he didn't stop hoping to get off the island. Once it actually came up, he was happy to do so. And so you'd say, his happiness improved by getting off the island in some important sense than if he'd stayed on that whole time. But so it seems like in ordinary usage, at least, hoping is something that's it's not the same as wishing, because there are lots of things that you might wish for that you don't hope for, but it's also something that's sort of more utopian than what you're actually striving for, because you give up on striving for lots of things.
Yeah, the suggestion is that maybe a closer concept to what I'm talking about than striving might be hoping, in cases where you can't really take any active effort to bring it about. Because the things we hope for that we aren't in any realistic sense striving for, we're not doing anything to bring them about, but nevertheless, hoping is narrower than wishing. There are lots of things I could wish for that I don't hope for. I wish Bill Gates would give me $1 million, but I don't hope he will. You can't really hope for something, and hoping is like trying in this sense. You can't hope for something if you think it's overwhelmingly unlikely. Now, exactly how overwhelmingly unlikely is, I'm not sure, but But still, it seems as though there are things that you just don't think are realistic possibilities, and so you don't hope for them, but you might still wish for them. Someone on a desert island might have given up anything like striving, but they might still hope to be rescued. I think that's a good suggestion, but now I think that maybe the concept I want is somewhere between hoping and striving, because you could be hoping without being in a state of tense readiness. Well, and you could be in a state of tense readiness, but I was kind of stretching the concept of striving to cover that. So, there ought to be a word for something that is more active than hoping, but not as active as striving. Hankering, maybe, but I like something, or longing, maybe. Because lots of things I hope for that I don't long for. It does seem as though if you long for something and you don't get it, it does seem as that I don't know that necessarily takes your happiness away, but it seems like some kind of blow to your happiness. If you're longing or yearning for something, you don't get it. If you're just hoping for something and don't get it, there are lots of things that I hope for, but some of the things I hope for may be just as unlikely as Bill Gates giving me $1 million. I mean, I suppose I hope for the triumph of anarchism, which means I must somehow think that's more likely than Bill Gates giving me $1 million, and you might wonder whether that's even true. But then the question is, do I long or yearn? Now I want something between longing and hoping. yeah, we got to slice this thinner and thinner. Yes.
Just thinking about ways to help this situation out. Maybe part of this overall idea of how a person's doing would have to include some psychological categories, and I don't know that this would be the one to say, but an example would be something like self-esteem, where a person would say, a person who said, "Oh, I have to do interplanetary travel in order to be a worthwhile person," and someone who doesn't travel is, really worthless or unimportant. And so concepts like psychology concepts like that, just like we would add in wealth and the traditional virtues like wisdom and justice, and we would add in heart health and lung health, that maybe there would be some constitutive psychological categories, self-esteem being one of them. What is the person set up in their head as being the absolute minimum, or the things that would qualify them as appropriate to life's challenges or something like that.
Yeah, so the question is whether a psychological category like self-esteem might be relevant here, where someone might think that they are, that they can't have self-esteem unless they can, have interplanetary travel or get out of the well or whatever, that there's certain things that are necessary for their self-esteem, and if they lack those, then they won't be happy. I think it's certainly true that if you lack something that you regard as necessary for your self-esteem, then you're not going to be happy. But I'm not sure it works the other way around. That is, it doesn't seem to me that having everything you need for your self-esteem is sufficient for happiness. Now, the Stoics would say it is. The Stoics would say, as long as you can maintain your proper self-esteem, of course, for them it has to be justified self-esteem. For the Stoics, you don't come as happy if you falsely think you're cool when you're not. But if you have properly grounded self-esteem, the Stoics can say that's all you need for happiness. Whereas Aristotle once can say, well, maybe that's a very important thing at the core of happiness. But still, Aristotle's going to say that if I've got a healthy self-esteem and I'm at the bottom of the well being bitten by the snakes, because you've forgotten the snakes, self-esteem maybe is certainly necessary for happiness and one of the most important things for happiness. But I think, well, it can't be sufficient. I mean, the example that Aristotle gives is if the things happen to you that happened to Priam, who was king of Troy in the story of the Trojan War, and all his family was slaughtered, and his city was burned, and so forth. And Aristotle gives him as an example of a man that he thinks was basically a good man who was living a happy life, and then through no fault of his own, nastiness descended on him. It does seem to me that, I'd like to think self-esteem is all you need, but but there are the snakes. Yeah.
Mises has the famous motto of striving ever boldly against evil,
Mm-hmm.
about working towards an ultimate end. And I was thinking about that in the previous lecture about how he may not have endorsed a final goal, but working towards that goal. I was wondering if maybe you could discuss or analyze that for a second.
Yeah, the mention is of Mises' slogan, his motto, which he got from Virgil, do not give in to evil, but proceed ever more boldly against it. The suggestion is, well, should we think of that as an end that you may not ever fully achieve, but you keep striving for, because I think Mises clearly isn't assuming that you're automatically guaranteed to win this battle. It's in fact something to sustain you during the period when you think you might not win it, but it's worth striving for it. In fact, that reminds me of a very unconsequential quote from Rand, who says, he who works for the future lives in it today. Which is a way of saying, even if you don't achieve the goal, somehow by striving for it, you are somehow realizing that goal in your life now, which is, I like that idea. I'm not sure how exactly it fits in with survival being the ultimate goal, but, well, I sort of see. But, so there's certainly a sense in which striving can be worth doing even if you don't succeed. Now, of course, obviously it's better if you do succeed, and the striving doesn't make much sense unless there's some value to the succeeding. But the value of striving doesn't depend solely, I think, on the value of succeeding. And that's, in a way, that's sort of the point I was trying to make here, is that you're not going to get everything you strive for. But that doesn't mean that it's not worth striving for, and it also doesn't mean that you should think your life is a failure if you don't get everything you strive for. In fact, that is what I'm trying to do, is to find a way to be able to consistently say all those things. That you shouldn't think you're going to get everything you'll strive for. But those things are worth striving for, and your life isn't a failure if you don't get them all. So that's part of the point Mises was making, since Mises, at the time he quoted that, well, he quoted it more than once, but one of the crucial times he quoted that was during a time when he had become very pessimistic. Different periods of life, he was more optimistic or more pessimistic, but this was around 1940, I think, when he just arrived in the U.S., and this was around the time when he wrote, he'd hoped to lead the way to the future, but he decided that all that was left was to be a historian of decline. So he was very despondent at that point. But I believe it was still in that context that he was quoting this line that the fact that you're not going to succeed in your goal is not a reason to stop trying, because the trying itself has a kind of nobility to it, we might say. Oh, yeah.
I have a question of whether or not you're going to need a further argument for the things worth striving for the preferences that you're striving to satisfy. Because it seems that you can reach this happiness or maximize preferences that are all perhaps inconsistent with some libertarian values, maximizing to be dumb or to be submissive or controlled or something like that. And you do actions to satisfy those preferences, which would lead you to a state of happiness. So I'm wondering how you're going to link that up with, or offer a further argument that will hook it up with the more libertarian values. If you're going to put constraints on the types of things we're striving for.
Okay. So the question is, do we need an argument for something more about the contents of these preferences? Because couldn't you have sort of a maximum consistent realization of your preferences, but your preferences could all be for really crappy things, or they could be for unlibertarian things like being dumb or being submissive. Now, if Walter Block were here, he would say, there's nothing unlibertarian about being dumb or being submissive. That's completely a question of morality. It's got nothing to do with libertarianism. But I won't say that. If he wanted to say that, he should have been here. No, you're absolutely right, and that's what succeeding lectures are going to be about. I think what I'm trying to do is give reasons. Again, as I said, I don't think I have a definitive story. I'm going to give reasons for more and more different ways of specifying the content of eudaimonia in such a way that it is going to force things in in non-crappy directions and ultimately in libertarian directions. So that's so that's what we're going to do over the next few sessions. Going to try and first show why your preferences should involve trying to be rational, why they should involve caring about other people's interests, and ultimately why they should involve not subordinating other people to your will, and not letting other people subordinate you to their will, and so forth. Again, I don't have sort of a grand deduction of all these things from first principles, but I'm going to try to show that it makes more sense to specify our conception of our preferences and our commitments in such a way that they go in that direction, and finally end up with wild-eyed anarchy on the last day.
This may be getting ahead of your schedule, or maybe just something lead into it, but I wonder if you talk about the unity of virtue principle in connection with this trade-offs argument against that. Like maybe sometimes you might argue that you might have to choose two moral claims may be both valid, but you put it with each other, you have to choose one over the other somehow. And maybe the virtues are in conflict with each other. And the Greek unity of virtue principle seems to deny that. So how would the Greeks answer that kind of argument against the unity of virtue principle?
Okay, so the question is, according to the story I've been presenting, we often have to make trade-offs. So you can't have everything you want of one thing, and you have to decide which one was more important. You weigh and balance these things. That you might think that the same thing is going to apply to morality or virtue. That you're going to have conflicting moral claims. You can't satisfy all of them, and so you try and satisfy the most important or something like that. But I've also endorsed the Greek thesis of unity of virtue, according to which the claims of the virtues are all harmonious with each other. They don't conflict. So how do I reconcile, on the one hand, this account of action I'm talking about, which has trade-offs going on all over the place, with this Greek account of virtue I'm trying to defend, according to which there are no ultimate trade-offs in virtue. Now, I'm going to talk more about this later, but here's the short version. What you trade off in determining the content of what the virtues require of you, what you trade off are not actual moral claims. Because if they're actual moral claims, then you're immoral if you don't satisfy them. That's what it means for it to be a moral claim. So it can never be the case that you get to dismiss a moral claim. But instead, the question is, sometimes sort of prima facie moral claims, when do they become genuine moral claims and when not? You might think this distinction is purely terminological. I think it's partly terminological. I don't think it's purely terminological, but it's cases where you're trying to decide what virtue requires of you, and what you've got is not conflicting full-fledged moral claims, because ought implies can. If there's a full-fledged moral claim on you that you ought to do X, then you ought to do X. And if there's a full-fledged moral claim on you that you ought to do not X, then you ought to do not X. Since you can't do both X and not X, it can't be the case that these are both full-fledged moral claims. However, when you're trying to figure out what your full-fledged moral claims are, you have sort of think of it the way I was talking about accommodationism versus utopianism, where you just have a kind of compromise between expanding happiness to include everything you can conceive of versus constricting it to include only what's available. And there's some reason to expand it, and there's some reason to contract it, and so you do a trade-off. But doing the trade-off, you're not, you're trying to come up with the right conception of happiness. So likewise, in cases of what look like moral conflict, where it seems like you've got some reason to do one thing and you've got some reason to do the opposite, it's not as though these are both full-fledged moral duties pulling you in opposite directions, because moral duties are supposed to be action-guiding. If it's really a moral duty, you have to do it. But rather, in figuring out what your moral duty is, there are sort of these prima facie moral duties, or considerations that will feed into your moral duties, and you have to figure out how to do those trade-offs. So in putting it that way, I think that the unity of virtue is consistent with trade-offs. The trade-offs are not trade-offs among the demands of the virtues. They're trade-offs among the demands of the prima facie considerations that you take into account in order to figure out the content of the virtues.
one might wonder then what, sort of how far sticking to the unity of virtue doctrine is going to undermine your case for there being sort of this single overarching end. So, right? Because if your argument for having a single end of eudaimonia rests on the fact that, in case of trade-offs between X and Y, you have to have some overarching standard that gives you a basis for the trade-off. But then you hold that there aren't any possible trade-offs between full-fledged courage and full-fledged temperance and full-fledged generosity and so forth. Then it looks like you can no longer make the case that there must be this sort of one thing happiness that's sort of overarching over all of them on the basis of the standards you would apply during the trade-off, because you just eliminated the possibility, even in principle, of having to make that trade-off. Right?
So the question is, part of my argument for there being a single overarching end of eudaimonia is this necessity of making trade-offs. I said, because if we make trade-offs, then there must be some aim we have in mind in making the trade-offs. It can't be either of them separately. It must be the overarching end. But then the question is, well, if I take this unity of virtue idea, according to which there aren't real trade-offs, and if I push that far enough, doesn't that undermine the case for there being an overarching end? My answer is going to be no, because the case for the unity of virtue presupposes the case for an overarching end. Now, if there's some other argument for the unity of virtue that bypasses it, then there might be a different story. But plus, I think also the story of how the unity of virtue works does involve, there's still trade-offs going on. They're not trade-offs among the virtues, but they're trade-offs among considerations. And in fact, people often think that Aristotle says that the virtuous person will never have any regrets about what they do, or never feel bad about it, never will do what they do reluctantly. Now it's true that they won't be reluctant to be virtuous. They won't be grudgingly virtuous, but and we'll talk more about this later. But no point. There's no reason not to mention it now. I can mention it again later too. Aristotle says that the courageous person who faces danger will feel, some reluctance to face it. They'll feel some fear. They won't be just overcome with fear, but Aristotle's conception of courage is not the person who's completely devoid of fear. It's the person whose fear is appropriate to the situation. And that doesn't mean that he's only afraid of things he ought to run away from. It means that if he faces a dangerous situation, there would be something inappropriate. He wouldn't be responding to an important aspect of the situation if he didn't feel fear. And another example from a former student of mine, Karen Storr, came up with this, I thought, an excellent example. Suppose you're a virtuous person and you have the job of breaking bad news to someone. Well, you ought to feel reluctant to do it. Now, your reluctance you shouldn't give in to that reluctance and say, wimp out and not do it. But nevertheless, if you just did your duty cheerfully, here I am bringing the news about your loved one's death, clearly there'd be something wrong. The virtuous person ought to feel that tension. And so once again, you can't get everything worth wishing for. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could elaborate on what the minimum threshold for where you're at maximum satisfaction or not. I know that's got to be context relative, but it just seems like it could be open to accusations of being arbitrary.
Okay, so the question is, can I say anything more about what the minimum threshold is above which you've got some kind of happiness and below which you're unhappy? And whether it's arbitrary. If it isn't arbitrary, what are the grounds for setting it? Well, I don't have any terribly worked out story about exactly what falls, on what side of the line. I mean, I gave this example that lacking electricity might put you below the line now, and wouldn't in Aristotle's day. But I'm not sure I want to say that lacking. I'm not sure what I want to say about lacking electricity. But I guess what I want to say is the way it's determined is that it's the answer's got to be whatever it is that our conceptions of happiness or our current desires and preferences commit us to. The way to find out is not to, it's not that we go out and do some empirical research to find out something. I don't think. Just we have to work out exactly what our conceptions of happiness are. we have some reason to construe our happiness in such a way that we could be perfectly happy without electricity. We have some reason to do that, namely that we'll be better off. We'll be more contented then should the lights go out. On the other hand, we've got some reason not to, because electricity is important and it's worth having and so forth. I don't have any story about whether electricity falls on one side of the line or the other. But anyway, it doesn't really matter whether I have a story. I'm not sure this has to be exactly the same for everybody. I think that happiness is generically the same for everybody, but I don't think it is specifically. So I think that what falls on one side of the line or the other could be different for different people. There are going to be some values that I think are going to be the same for all, that everyone's committed to. But and Cicero has this nice example of these different levels. He distinguishes between your universal nature as a human being and your individual nature. And universal nature is the most important in determining your happiness, but individual nature matters too. So, can Mozart live a happy life without access to a musical instrument or a sheet paper to write notes on? Probably not. Probably Mozart without access to musical instruments is going to be unhappy. That'll push him below his minimum threshold. I think there are other people for whom, although they might miss not having musical instruments around to compose, they might like it or something. It's not going to be a big deal for them. It's not going to push them below the threshold. But ultimately, it's just a matter of what's the most coherent and consistent way of working out what your preferences commit you to. And so then the boundary might be a fuzzy one. In fact, it's bound to be a fuzzy one. It's not as though there's going to be some clear, definite cutoff. I think we can still identify things that are pretty plausible on one side or the other. If you're on the rack being tortured, then you're on the wrong side of the line. Now the Stoics didn't think so. The Stoics think as long as you've got your virtue, you're fine. But it seems for most of us, the way we construct our commitments, that would be the wrong line. But if there's a fuzzy boundary, well, so what? A famous example from philosophy, there's a fuzzy boundary about where the outback begins. Not the restaurant, but the actual area of Australia. Certainly there is an outback, and we can think of things that are in it and things that are not in it. But, exactly where does it start? Well, the fact that we can't say exactly where it starts, and there's a big puzzle in philosophy about exactly what to say about fuzzy boundaries. But whatever the right story is to say about them, we know there are such things, and it doesn't invalidate a concept just because we can't figure out how to define a precise line. I mean, we can't even say exactly where the fuzziness starts, because that's a fuzzy boundary too. That's the real nightmare about vagueness. But whatever the right thing is to say about that, it's not a special problem for any particular area of inquiry. It's sort of all over the place. Yeah.
Just one more thought about our discussion about why it's important to strive, even if your attainment of your goal is slim or unlikely. And do you think Aristotle would have said, well, that's an opportunity to act courageously? So, it wouldn't be good for me, let's say one of my occupations was basketball, challenge all the 10-year-olds in the neighborhood, and beat them 21-0. When I won games, it might be
wouldn't work if I did it.
to challenge someone at a higher skill level, or if you're Mises, you're not exercising courage by becoming a Keynesian and getting an academic post, but
would be here. Well, no, it's not courage if it's an unvirtuous end.
But you would be exercising one of your constitutive means, courage, and maybe even justice as well by advocating free market policies, even if you thought chances are you would go.
Yeah. So the point is that there are the cases where it's worth striving for something that you're probably not going to achieve are often going to be cases where it'll be more virtuous, more courageous, or more just, or whatever, to do that striving. And expressing virtue is a valuable thing in and of itself, even apart from the goals, further goals it promotes. Now, Stoics would have said, completely apart from the goals it promotes. But Aristotle at least would say its value is not exhausted. The value of trying to save your city from an attack is not exhausted by the value of succeeding. The value of trying to defend freedom is not exhausted by the value of succeeding. Yeah, that's right. And we are out of time. So.